All right, welcome back everyone. Dr. Ben, not a real doctor here. So this is helping with the video today. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between an active stretch and a pandiculation. So I had a question, what was the difference? And we're going to talk about it today. We can summarize very quickly in a nutshell. Quit wagging your butt at the camera. In a nutshell, a pandiculation is actually not a stretch at all, whereas an active stretch involves a muscle contraction instead of a muscle trying to relax the muscle. We're going to talk a little bit about the stretch reflex and why that is one of the key factors of an actual stretch as opposed to a pandiculation. Real quick to talk about the stretch reflex. When you are involved in a stretch and you start to feel that muscle tighten, you get to the end of your range of motion. That's not actually the end of the range of motion of your muscle. That is your nervous system causing an involuntary contraction to try and keep you out of a position that your nervous system thinks is unsafe. For example, like a position that you're not strong enough to get back out of. It's a safety mechanism built into your nervous system. Hey. It's a safety mechanism built into your nervous system to keep you safe, basically. And active stretches work to override that stretch reflex to help you have more usable range of motion in your muscles. Pandiculation works in your nervous system to reset basically where that stretch reflex kicks in. So that is the major difference between a pandiculation and a stretch. Now, like I said, with an active stretch, you're going to actually consciously, intentionally contract your muscle, whereas in a passive stretch, you're just going to go until you hit that stretch reflex and then just wait the stretch reflex out. An active stretch, you're going to use active contraction of your muscles to override that stretch reflex. So let's zoom out a little bit here. It's snowing again today, so we're shooting in my little tiny office, but we're going to demonstrate some active stretches and talk to you about how they're different than pandiculations. So the two types of stretching that I usually think of when I think of active stretching is going to be resistance stretching and PNF stretching. PNF stretching is short for proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. So we're just going to stick with PNF. So first, in resistance stretching, we're going to use a good old hamstring stretch as an example here. Now, a classic passive stretch for the hamstrings would be basically just sit up here in a nice L-shaped position, bend forward at the hips until you feel the stretch reflex kick in along the hamstrings, maybe the calf, maybe the glutes, and then you just hang out here. Most people will bend forward, but at this point you're involving a lot of back stretch and taking some of the stretch out of the hamstrings. So just bend forward at the hips, let that stretch kick in, and then you just hold this. And that stretch reflex is going to be a muscle contraction back here in my hamstrings. And like any contraction, over time, that contraction will relax, it will weaken. Your nervous system will get more comfortable in the position. You will build a tiny bit of strength just because of that contraction, but not a significant amount of strength. That's sort of the difference between flexibility and mobility, in my opinion. But over time, doing this regularly for long periods of time, that stretch reflex will reset and you'll develop the ability to go further into the stretch before that stretch reflex kicks in. Now, for an active stretch, and we're going to do resistance stretching first here. Okay, I've shared this stretch on my channel before, so this won't be like a instructional video. We're just going to talk about how it works so that we can talk about active stretching. So I'm going to get up here, place my hands basically above my knee, and when I start to feel that stretch reflex kick in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push my leg down into my hands here. So I'm going to do a motion like this with my leg. All right, and that's going to engage these hamstring muscles. It'll engage the glutes, the calves a little bit, everything along the back of my leg here to some degree. Okay, and as I push into this, now remember I already got to the point where I started to feel that stretch reflex kick in, which is an involuntary muscle contraction. Now we're using a voluntary muscle contraction, and I'm going to pull that leg further into the stretch. And because I've voluntarily contracted the muscle, the stretch reflex doesn't work quite the same way. We're shorting out the stretch reflex. Now this also has the added benefit of building strength at this end range of motion here, because we're voluntarily contract. Boy, I'm having a lot of trouble with that word today. Voluntarily contracting the muscle here at our end range of motion, we're getting a much stronger contraction than what a involuntary stretch reflex contraction would give us. So I'm pushing hard into my hands and then also pulling that muscle further into the stretch. This is what we call an eccentric contraction, which means we are contracting the muscle as it is lengthening, okay? So this hamstring is getting longer, but it's also contracting forcefully. And this is a little bit more like an actual, what we think of working out sets and reps kind of situation, right? So I'm gonna do this like 6 to 12 times, 1 to 3 sets. And this is gonna be a little bit more like a classic strength training workout to build mobility. Now, mind you, I did say mobility because you are going to get more mobility rather than flexibility. Remember, in my opinion, mobility is using that new range of motion, whereas flexibility is just a position that you can relax into, okay? So this is resistance stretching. Get to that stretch reflex, contract the muscles, push hard into my hands, and pull that muscle further into its range of motion. Now, PNF stretching is actually very similar to resistance stretching. It was actually co-founded by the guy who created resistance stretching. If you're interested in that, the book is Meridian Flexibility, Bob Cooley. That's where I first learned about it. I'll put a link in the description below for you. But it's an interesting read if you want to go deeper into active stretching. So PNF stretching, basically what you're going to do is you're going to get till you feel that stretch reflex, which is in a very different play. You can already see the stretch reflex for me isn't kicking in till here, which is significantly different when I started the video. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an isometric contraction. So an isometric contraction means the muscle is not shortening or lengthening. You are applying that contraction and holding it in place. So like if you push against a wall that doesn't move, that's an isometric contraction. We're going to get into position where we feel that stretch reflex kick in. You're going to go for a maximal, as hard as you can, contraction, and you're going to hold that for 3 to 5 seconds. This one is very intense, okay? And then after that time period, you're just going to relax the muscle, all right? And you'll see I dropped a considerable distance further, and the nervous system is starting to be a little unhappy. You can see things shaking here. That's because the nervous system doesn't like me being in this position, and it's trying to figure out what to do. And you'll do this 2 or 3 times. So in the new position, you're going to hang out there, rest, relax, and let the nervous system adjust. And then you're once again, strong isometric contraction, 3 to 5 seconds, and then relax. And you can see I dropped a little bit again. And what we're doing with this PNF stretch is, again, we are overriding, we are short-circuiting the stretch reflex. We're forcing the nervous system to reassess. But because we're using such strong contractions, we're also building strength at that end range of motion. There's a lot of stuff out there that says stretching doesn't work, which personally I think is BS. I personally, and many people I know, have had great results with both passive and active stretching. It's more how you apply it. So that covers the 2 active stretches, all right? We're gonna use a slightly different, we're still gonna stick with the hamstrings, and we're gonna stay with the right leg even though he's getting a workout today. So for a pandiculation, remember I said earlier that there is actually no stretch involved in a pandiculation if you're doing it correctly. It's not supposed to be a stretch. Whereas with a stretch, you are engaging that stretch reflex and you are forcing the nervous system to deal with the stretch reflex and where it's applied. In a pandiculation, what you're actually doing is you are doing a nervous system reset, where your nervous system has to reassess the resting tone and resting position of the musculature that you're engaging in the pandiculation. I know that sounds really complicated. It's basically your nervous system figuring out how relaxed the muscle should be when at rest. Okay? So for this example, it's not going to work fantastic because I'm not going to slide real good on this. So a pandiculation is going to work with a concentric contraction, which basically means contraction as the muscle shortening. This is the classic contraction that most people think of. If you're doing a bicep curl, on the way up, the concentric contraction is what's happening. So contracting as the muscle shortening. Now, for this guy, we're going to do a concentric contraction and engage those hamstring muscles. And then what we're going to do is a controlled relaxation of those muscles. So we're not trying to contract the muscles on the way down. We're not thinking contract. We are thinking release. And I know that sounds like a subtle difference, but it is not to your nervous system. There is a big difference between contracting and releasing to the nervous system. Okay, that's where mindset matters. And what we're doing now is we're trying to go slowly and feel those muscles release so that our nervous system can reassess their resting position and also reset their resting position. Now, I'm not going to get a lot of benefit from this because I'm talking. Pandiculation requires a lot of focus and concentration. You need your nervous system to be attentive to what that muscle is doing so it can actively reassess where that muscle is and what it's doing. But the important thing to understand here is as I'm doing this, I'll just show you, if I went all the way down to the point where I started getting a stretch in this right hamstring, you're talking right about there is where I'm starting to feel a stretch in my right leg. So you can see, as I'm doing this, I'm stopping far short of my stretch reflex engaging. And that is what makes pandiculation not a stretch, and instead a nervous system reset. All of these techniques are very, very helpful in building mobility and restoring function and eliminating pain. It is important to know how to apply them and when each one fits. I'm not the guy who will tell you that this is pandiculation is the cure for everything or active stretching is the cure for everything. I use all of these techniques, including manual manipulation like trigger point therapy, self-massage. Sometimes I use some extremely aggressive, technically passive stretching to get things to release. I use whatever I need to do in my personal experimentation with my body and my situation to get the result that I need in the safest, most efficient way possible for me. Younger in my days, safety wasn't necessarily the concern. It was more like effectiveness. I didn't really give a crap if it hurt me in the process so long as I got where I was going. And that has been my evolution with this process. It's one of the reasons why I've learned so much about so many different things is because sometimes pandiculation doesn't work for me and I have to go with a manual release therapy like trigger point release. It's important to have as many tools as possible to help you get where you want to go. But I hope that answers your question about what the difference is between an active stretch and a pandiculation. While they might seem very similar, they're actually very different and they work in very different ways. Between the two of them, like the PNF, you can maybe consider a little closer to a pandiculation because it involves a release. However, it is still working to short circuit your stretch reflex and not necessarily reset your nervous system in the same way that a pandiculation does. Anyway, if you guys have more questions, if you want to hear more about this, I would like to do a full, longer video talking about the nervous system and muscles and how all of that works. So look for that in the future. That will probably be very long. It may be a mini course on my website. But let me know what you guys think about that. If you'd like to see something like that, hit me up in the comments down below. If you liked the video, smash that thumbs up. If you know somebody who can benefit from this, share the video with them. If you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing. And until next time, keep your life in motion.